Hello, everyone. Warm greetings from UNICEF. My name is Anna Predanovic, and I'm the Child Rights Monitoring Specialist here in Serbia. And I'm with you today to present the findings of UNICEF's longitudinal research on the effects of the COVID pandemic on families with children in Serbia. I will be presenting in English, whereas the PowerPoint is in Serbian, so please feel free to follow whichever of the two is more suitable for you. To start off with, I'll say that the research happened in 3 waves. The first wave happened in April 2020, while the state of emergency was still on. The second wave happened in June and July of 2020, just after the state of emergency ended. And then we repeated a third wave with the same respondents in March 2021. This was to capture the more longer-term effects. The thematic areas that were covered through the research was the household economy, parenthood and family relationships, health services, social welfare services, education, and mental health. The methodology of the research is explained here on this slide. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but just to say that approximately 80% of the interviews took place through phone and approximately 20% through auto-responding to an online questionnaire. And the first wave managed to cover around just over 1,800 households. And then we had sort of some attrition in the second and third waves, ending with 745 households, as roughly expected, that covered around 1,000 children. So let me start first by saying a little bit about the household economy findings. Generally, the negative effect of the pandemic on household income was somewhat mitigated in this last third wave, but was still present. And there was a reduction in income that can definitely be traced as a result of the pandemic. In 2021, a quarter of all households with children still reported a decreased income compared to before the pandemic. There were also unplanned costs during the pandemic, and they were still registered in 2021 in the third wave in about a quarter of households with children, although their structure had changed since the first wave, and they were now significantly more related to health costs. Spending savings was in 2021 still the main strategy of survival, and it was present in almost 2/3 of all households, a slight increase from the second wave. And in second place, there was also borrowing of money in about a third of households, whose income had decreased by 10% or more, which was also slightly higher than in the second wave. The sale of assets as a mechanism of coping was rarely applied in about 33% of cases. If we were to summarize, we could say that economic instability was most felt by the poorest households, or those with the lowest monthly income, and particularly those that would not be able to tolerate sudden financial costs. A reduction in income in at least one wave was reported by these households, whereas An increase in income in the third wave is most often reported by households with the highest incomes. So what we could see from the results is somewhat of a further stratification of income in households with children, with those who had less before the pandemic having further less, and those who had more having a bit more. The region of South and East Serbia reports economic difficulties to a greater extent, and this was somewhat expected. But also households from urban settlements report more economic problems than households from rural areas. When we talk about parenthood and family relationships, we can say that parenthood was very difficult during the period of emergency, became slightly more bearable just after the emergency, and then in the third wave we can see that there is a certain difficulty experienced by parents again, almost as high as in the first wave, and in fact exactly the same as in the first wave. So that was a bit of a concern to us when we observed that. When parents were asked about their worries in relation to their child, the 4% of parents responded that they're worried about disagreements in the family. This was around 33% in the second wave and 4% in the first wave. So these these types of worries are more often mentioned by parents from Belgrade. Otherwise, the main worries are related mostly to health, socializing, and educational needs of children. When we talk about access of children to health, education, and social welfare services, we can say that with regards to health, there is a certain improvement in access to health services after the end of the period of emergency. And in the third wave, there is a slight increase compared to the second wave in both health and social services. If we look at all the research waves, the health services were missing most often for the youngest children, 0 to 6. And this was in about a fifth of all cases, whereas for older children, they were slightly more accessible. The pandemic did not significantly impact the use of services of private doctors. Approximately 4/5 of children do not use the services of private doctors, but among those who do use them, there was no significant effect of the pandemic on that. When it comes to education, most parents of children 7 to 17 estimated that distance learning had affected a reduction in their child's motivation to learn. And apart from the decrease in motivation, they also think that it impacted the quality of their child's education. When it comes to mental health, for almost a fifth of children, the pandemic had an impact on a worsening of their mental state, according to their parents' assessment. So the parents would now rate it as worse than before the pandemic. And this is to a greater extent among children of older ages between 13 and 17 in households with lower income from Belgrade and from other urban areas. To summarize, the negative effects of the pandemic outweigh the positive effects significantly. The strongest negative effects of the pandemic were registered in households from Belgrade when we look at all the indicators overall. The region of South and East Serbia, and to a greater extent, reports about economic difficulties. And when looked at from the perspective of all the observed indicators, the pandemic was more impactful on urban rather than rural areas. I thank you very much for your attention and stand ready for any questions. Thank you.